Hi, today I'll guide you through the basics of using the Laravel framework. This tutorial is aimed at complete beginners, and the goal is to introduce you to the Laravel default directory structure. If you're unsure how to install Laravel, I have a dedicated video on my channel that covers the installation process. The link is in the description. Laravel follows the Model View Controller (MVC) design pattern. This means the model represents data and usually interacts with the database. The view is responsible for displaying data, like HTML. The controller acts as an intermediary between the model and the view. It processes user input, calls specific methods to manipulate data, and returns the appropriate output. This design pattern helps separate different parts of the application, which is crucial. For example, we should never mix HTML generation with business logic, which can easily happen when using raw PHP. When you open a newly installed Laravel project, you'll notice there are many folders and files. Let's go over their usage. The app directory is one of the most important directories. By default, 3 subdirectories are created here: http/controllers, models, and providers. In the models directory, we store model files, and in controllers, we store controller files. In model files, relationships are usually defined, showing how your model is connected with other models. You can also specify properties such as which database table the model is associated with, which fields can be changed, or how certain columns should be cast, like converting a column to JSON, etc. In controller files, you define methods for handling requests. Your controller triggers specific actions and returns results, for example, a view file with HTML or a JSON response. Providers are used for registering services. It is the central place to configure the application. This will be explained in future videos. As a complete beginner, you won't use it much, and it's hard to explain its role without understanding many other concepts. In the app directory, you can also create your own directories. For example, you might create a folder to store classes responsible for business logic or anything else related to your application. This is the place for anything directly connected to your application. In the bootstrap directory, there is an app file, which is used to bootstrap the framework. For now, we will skip it, as it will be covered in future tutorials. In the config directory, configuration files are stored. By default, there are many of them. You can create your own config file by returning a PHP array with keys and values. Then, in almost any part of your application, you can access these values using the config helper function. The default config files have comments describing their usage, but if you're just starting with Laravel, you probably won't need to change anything. For example, in the database config file, different connections for various databases are defined. If you want to use a different database than the default one, you can simply change one word in another file, which will be explained shortly, to configure everything for that database. Most default config files work in this way, so don't worry about the number of them. Remember not to store any sensitive data, like passwords or secret API keys, directly in config files. These files are not included in the gitignore, so all configs will be uploaded to the repository if you use one. There's a different file designed for that in the root directory, the env file. This is where you store secret data or environment-specific configurations. You may want to configure certain things separately for local development and production environments. The env file is included in the gitignore, so it won't be uploaded. When you set up your application on a production server, you'll create a separate env file for that environment. There is an env example file where you can specify keys, like in the env file, but without values, or with placeholder values, so it can be copied and filled in with the appropriate data later. In the env file, you can create any key and access it using the env helper. However, it's important not to use the env helper directly in your code, as these values won't be cached. The best practice is to create a config file that retrieves values from the env file. This way, you won't lose performance, and your sensitive data will remain secure. In the default config files, you'll see many keys that use environment variables. The second parameter of the env helper function is the default value, which is used if the specified key isn't found in the env file. Now let's move on to the database directory. There you'll see 3 subdirectories: factories, migrations, and seeders. Factories are used to generate fake data. For example, you can define how users should be created, such as having random names, random but hashed passwords, etc. Factories are typically used for testing purposes, so you don't have to manually add many new rows to your database. For now, you don't need to use it. In the migrations directory, there are files responsible for creating your database schema. When you build an application, you write code that requires a specific database structure. For instance, if you want to select users by a specific email, when you write this query, you know the column exists because you've created it. If your database structure is different from what your app expects, it can lead to many problems. That's why you should avoid making direct changes to the database. Migrations handle this for you. Need a new table? No problem. Just create a migration for it. Need to change a column type? Create a migration for that too. This ensures that your database structure matches your needs. This is especially useful when working with different environments. When you deploy your application to production, you just need to run one command, and your database schema will be generated exactly as it was in development. When working in a team, your teammates don't need to ask you for the database schema or an SQL file to import. They can just run one command. Seeders are responsible for adding data to your database, usually static data like dictionaries. For example, if you need a list of country codes stored in the database, you wouldn't want to add this data manually or separately on the production server. Instead, you create a seeder where you define what should be inserted. Then, you can run a command to seed your database with the data defined in seeders. You can also add a parameter to the migration command to seed the database automatically after the structure is created, allowing you to control both the database schema and the required data. The public directory is responsible for storing publicly accessible data such as JavaScript, CSS, or images. It is also the starting point of your application. All requests are handled by the index file, which auto-loads everything needed and bootstraps the application. The resources directory has 3 subdirectories by default: JS, CSS, and views. In the JS and CSS directories, you can store uncompiled JS scripts and CSS files. The views directory typically contains HTML templates. Laravel uses special files with the Blade PHP extension, which allow you to use PHP variables or functions without needing to open and close PHP tags. As a result, your code is much cleaner. Laravel then compiles these files into raw PHP, so you don't lose performance. In the routes directory, you can define the routes for your application, specifying how specific resources should be accessed. There are files for console and web routes. For now, let's focus on web. Let's start with an example. If a user visits /about and you want to display the About page, you would need to add a line to define: when a user accesses this URI, this controller should be called, and this method should be executed. In the same way, you can create routes for handling different request types, like post, etc. Routes specified in this file come with default configurations, such as CSRF protection or cookie encryption, things you typically need. There's also an API routes file, which is not visible by default and should be used when handling stateless requests, like a RESTful API that might be authenticated via tokens. In the storage directory, logs, cache, and other files generated by the framework are stored. There is a subdirectory called app, where you can store files generated by your application. You can store user files there, which may or may not be publicly accessible. The tests directory is for automatic testing of your application. Here, you can create unit or feature tests. If you're unfamiliar with these, don't worry, they will be explained in future videos. For now, it's enough to know that this is where you store automatic tests, which can simulate, for example, a user accessing your page or performing specific actions to check if the output matches your expectations. In unit tests, you check if the logic of specific methods works as expected. The vendor directory contains dependencies, such as installed packages. This code is not uploaded to the repository, and you should not change anything there. Dependencies are defined with versions in the composer.json file. When you install your application on a production server or when your teammate syncs with your changes, missing dependencies are downloaded based on the composer.json file and stored in the vendor directory. Package.json is used for Node.js dependencies and works similarly to Composer.json. PHP-unit.xml is a configuration file for testing where you can set different environment values for testing purposes. This will be explained in the video about testing. Vite.config.js is the configuration file for Vite, which is used for building and optimizing front-end assets. That's everything about the default directories and files. Many other files are hidden by default. To show them, you'll need to run a command or use a feature that requires them. In the next tutorials, building Laravel apps will be explained, and everything connected with directory structure not covered in this video will be presented. That's all for now.